Nehemiah's epic triumph, outwitting foes to rescue Jerusalem. Have you ever stood amid shattered dreams, facing ruins where your hopes once lived? Imagine the crushing weight of witnessing your homeland, the sacred resting place of your ancestors, reduced to charred gates and crumbling walls, its people vulnerable and ashamed in a world of predators. This was the reality that confronted one man who dared to hope when all seemed lost. The story of Nehemiah speaks directly to our modern struggles with seemingly impossible challenges. His journey from royal cupbearer to visionary rebuilder demonstrates how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary feats when they combine unwavering faith with strategic action. The rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls wasn't merely a construction project. It was a powerful statement of identity, resistance, and hope that continues to inspire those facing overwhelming obstacles today. The man behind the cup, in the sprawling royal complex of Susa, capital of the mighty Persian Empire, Nehemiah moved with practiced precision through the marble corridors. The weight of the silver wine vessel in his hands was familiar, a responsibility he had carried for years as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, the most powerful ruler in the known world. The afternoon light streamed through high windows, catching the ruby depths of the wine as Nehemiah approached the king's table. The royal court buzzed with the murmured conversations of nobles and officials. Incense hung in the air, its sweet scent mingling with the aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread from the royal kitchens. Nehemiah's sandals whispered against the polished floor as he approached the king, his face composed in the pleasant, neutral expression expected of royal servants. "Your wine, my lord," Nehemiah said, bowing as he presented the cup. Artaxerxes nodded absently, his attention focused on the ambassador speaking before him. Nehemiah stepped back to his position against the wall, invisible yet ever-present as befitted his station. Few understood the true significance of Nehemiah's role. To most, he was simply a servant, albeit a trusted one. Yet the position of cupbearer carried immense responsibility and influence. Each day, Nehemiah tasted the king's wine before it touched royal lips, risking his own life to protect the monarch from poisoning. This daily act of loyalty had, over the years, placed him in the inner circle of the Persian court. The palace walls might have been his home, but Nehemiah's heart dwelled elsewhere, in a city he had never seen, a place known to him only through stories passed down by his elders. Jerusalem, the city of David, the heart of his ancestors' homeland, pulled at his spirit like a distant melody. Marcus, a fellow Judean who served in the royal guard, often shared news from travelers passing through Susa. Their conversations took place in hushed tones during the quieter evening hours, away from curious ears. "Have you heard any word of our homeland?" Nehemiah would ask whenever they met. On one particular evening in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, Nehemiah encountered Marcus in the palace gardens. The winter air was cool, and few others braved the evening chill to walk among the dormant flower beds. "My brother, Hanani, has returned from Judah," Marcus said, his expression grave. "He brings news of Jerusalem." Nehemiah's heart quickened. "Tell me everything." As the stars appeared overhead, Marcus relayed Hanani's report, each word striking Nehemiah like a physical blow. "The survivors who remained after the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem lies broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Though the Babylonian exile had ended decades ago, and some Jews had returned to their homeland, Jerusalem remained vulnerable. Without walls, the city lay exposed to bandits, hostile neighbors, and wild animals. More importantly, in the ancient world, a city without walls was a city without honor, a shameful testament to weakness and divine abandonment. The weight of this news pressed Nehemiah to the garden bench. His hands trembled as he covered his face. "How long?" he whispered. "How long must our people suffer this shame?" For days afterward, Nehemiah moved through his duties like a man in a dream. The opulence of the Persian palace, its gilded columns and jeweled walls, suddenly seemed hollow against the image of Ruth. At night, he would lie awake, imagining the exposed city, its people living in constant fear. What can one man do? He asked himself in the darkness. But even as the question formed, another voice seemed to answer from the depths of his spirit. With God, one man can change everything. Resolved to action but uncertain of the path forward, Nehemiah turned to the one source of strength he knew would not fail him. Setting aside food and drink, he entered a period of fasting and prayer, wrestling with his anguish before the God of heaven. His prayers echoed the ancient words of confession, acknowledging not only the sins of his people, but his own failings and those of his ancestors. Day after day, in the quiet moments between his royal duties, Nehemiah laid his heart bare before God. "O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments," he prayed, his voice barely audible in his private chamber. "Let your ear be attentive, and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel." As Nehemiah prayed, a plan began to form in his mind. A dangerous, audacious plan that would require divine intervention to succeed. For he would need to approach the king, not merely as a servant with a cup, but as a man with a request that could change history. The moment of truth. 4 months passed as Nehemiah continued his daily palace duties, while fasting and praying in private. He watched and waited for the right moment, knowing that approaching the king required perfect timing. In the royal court, even the slightest misstep could mean disaster. In the month of Nisan, Nehemiah entered the king's presence carrying the wine cup as usual. But this day was different. The weight of Jerusalem's plight had etched itself into his face, eroding his carefully maintained courtier's mask. The grand banquet hall stretched before him, its walls adorned with intricate carvings depicting Persian victories. Queen Damaspia sat beside the king, her presence unusual for a daytime meal. Nehemiah's heart pounded as he approached the royal couple, the wine trembling slightly in the cup. As he placed the vessel before Artaxerxes, the king looked up, his brow furrowing. "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This can only be sadness of heart." In the Persian court, displaying sadness before the king was considered highly inappropriate, potentially even treasonous. The monarch's question hung in the air like a drawn sword. The room fell silent as courtiers paused their conversations, sensing the tension. Fear gripped Nehemiah. In that moment of crisis, he offered a silent prayer, the briefest yet perhaps the most sincere of his life. "God, give me favor." "May the king live forever," Nehemiah replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my ancestors' graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" King Artaxerxes studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What is it you want?" Another silent prayer rose from Nehemiah's heart as he faced this pivotal moment, the culmination of months of planning and prayer. "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, send me to Judah, to the city of my ancestors' graves, that I may rebuild it." The request was extraordinary. A personal servant asking to leave his post for an extended period to rebuild a distant city. Moreover, Jerusalem had a troubled history with Persian authorities, having been considered rebellious in the past. The silence lengthened as Artaxerxes considered the request. Queen Nehemiah leaned over to whisper something to her husband. Nehemiah waited, barely breathing. "How long will your journey take? And when will you return?" the king finally asked. Hope flared in Nehemiah's chest. He specified a time, and to his amazement, the king granted his request. Emboldened by this favorable response, Nehemiah pressed further. "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." These were not small requests. They required royal resources, official documentation, and implicit Persian support for rebuilding a city that had once been considered a threat to empire. Yet to Nehemiah's astonishment, Artaxerxes granted everything he asked for. Even more, the king provided a military escort, cavalry and army officers, to ensure his safe passage to Jerusalem. As Nehemiah left the royal presence with permissions in hand, he knew with certainty that God had answered his prayers. "The gracious hand of my God was upon me," he would later recall, recognizing that no ordinary political maneuvering could have secured such favor. In the weeks that followed, Nehemiah moved with focused intensity, assembling provisions, gathering the royal letters, and preparing for the journey. The palace officials, many of whom had known him for years, watched with curiosity as the trusted cupbearer transformed into a man with a mission that transcended palace intrigues. Not everyone welcomed this development. Eleazar, a Persian official who had long harbored suspicions about the Jewish population within the empire, watched Nehemiah's preparations with narrowed eyes. "You're making a grave mistake, trusting him with royal authority," Eleazar warned a colleague. "These Jews have always been trouble for the empire. Their loyalties lie elsewhere." Word of such whispers reached Nehemiah, but he remained undeterred. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the long road that would lead him to Jerusalem. Before departing, Nehemiah visited the Jewish quarter of Susa, where he spoke to the elders of his community. In a humble gathering place, lit by oil lamps and filled with the faces of his people, he shared his plans and asked for their prayers. "After all these years, God has opened a door," he told them, his voice resonating with conviction. "The walls of Jerusalem will rise again." The journey from Susa to Jerusalem would take approximately 3 months, covering almost 1,000 miles across rivers, deserts, and mountain passes. As Nehemiah's caravan departed the Persian capital, the royal documents secured in a leather pouch against his chest, he knew he was leaving behind security and comfort for unknown challenges. But in his heart, he was finally heading home. Confronting ruins and rising opposition, the journey from Persia to Jerusalem was arduous. For nearly 3 months, Nehemiah's caravan traveled the royal road, crossing the mighty Euphrates River and traversing the arid landscapes of Syria before descending into the Judean hills. The Persian military escort, with their gleaming armor and tall spears, ensured safe passage through territories known for banditry and tribal warfare. As they crested the final ridge, Jerusalem came into view in the distance, a sight that stopped Nehemiah mid-stride. The ancient city of David sat vulnerably on its hill, its broken walls clearly visible even from afar. The temple, rebuilt decades earlier, stood as the only testament to the city's former glory, while around it humble dwellings clustered like huddled survivors. The reality was far worse than the reports had suggested. Where mighty fortifications once stood, only scattered stones remained. The gates, once the pride of the city with their massive wooden doors and iron fittings, were nothing but charred frames against the evening sky. Ezekiel, a temple priest who had come to welcome the new arrival, watched Nehemiah's face as he surveyed the devastation. "What you see has been our shame for generations," he said quietly. "We have learned to live with exposed flanks, like sheep without a fold." Nehemiah nodded silently, the weight of the task ahead settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The Persian soldiers exchanged glances, some clearly questioning whether protecting this broken city was worth the empire's resources. Despite his royal credentials, Nehemiah's arrival did not immediately inspire confidence among Jerusalem's inhabitants. Years of hardship had taught them to be wary of grand promises. Some, like the merchant Joachim, expressed their skepticism openly. "Another official with parchments and promises," Joachim remarked to his wife, as Nehemiah's party passed through the market area. "We've seen many come and go, while our walls remain in dust." For 3 days, Nehemiah remained largely secluded in his quarters, receiving only a few visitors and revealing little of his plans. This period of apparent inaction sparked speculation among both supporters and critics. Some thought he was disillusioned by the extent of the devastation. Others suspected political motives behind his arrival. In truth, Nehemiah was engaged in intense prayer and strategic planning. He knew that his first actions would set the tone for everything that followed. On the third night, when the city had fallen into deep slumber, Nehemiah slipped out with just 3 trusted companions. Mounting a sturdy mule, he began a systematic inspection of Jerusalem's perimeter. The pale moonlight cast long shadows as they picked their way through debris-strewn paths where proud walls once stood. "No one knows of this nighttime survey," Nehemiah instructed his companions. "We must see the full extent of the damage before we speak of rebuilding." The southern section of the wall near the valley gate was so badly damaged that Nehemiah's mule could not pass through the rubble. He dismounted and continued on foot, sometimes climbing over piles of fallen stones, other times skirting wide gaps where entire sections of wall had disappeared. At the fountain gate, the stench of stagnant water filled the air. The drainage systems had failed without proper maintenance, creating pools of fetid water. Near the king's pool, jackals slunk away at their approach, evidence of how wilderness had reclaimed portions of the once great city. As they rounded the eastern side, the darkness nearly complete beneath the shadow of the Mount of Olives, Nehemiah placed his hand on a section of surviving wall. The stone was cool under his palm, solid despite centuries of weathering. "Even in ruins, the craftsmanship speaks," he whispered. "We aren't building something new. We're restoring what was meant to stand forever." By the time they completed the circuit and returned through the valley gate, the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. Nehemiah's clothing was torn in places, his hands dirty from examining the rubble, but his eyes burned with purpose. The following day, he called a meeting of the city's leaders, priests, nobles, and officials. They gathered in the open area near the temple, the morning sun illuminating their weary faces. Some, like Eliashib the high priest, came out of respect for Nehemiah's royal appointment. Others, like the merchant Joachim, came out of curiosity. All were unprepared for what they heard. "You see the trouble we are in," Nehemiah began, his voice carrying across the assembly. "Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, so that we may no longer suffer derision." Then, with growing intensity, he shared how God had clearly moved the heart of King Artaxerxes, granting not only permission but resources for the reconstruction. "The hand of my God was good upon me," he declared, producing the royal documents as evidence of divine favor. "The king has sent me to rebuild, and he has provided letters for safe passage and timber for construction." A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications became clear. This was not merely another visitor with empty promises. This was a divinely appointed mission with Persian imperial backing. But before the assembly could fully process this news, an unwelcome interruption came from the edge of the gathering. Sanballat the Horonite, governor of neighboring Samaria, stepped forward with Tobiah the Ammonite official at his side. Their presence at this internal Jerusalem meeting was itself a statement, an assertion that nothing happened in the region without their knowledge. "What is this thing that you are doing?" Sanballat called out, his voice dripping with contempt. "Are you rebelling against the king? The accusation of rebellion? The very charge that had halted Jerusalem's rebuilding in previous generations hung dangerously in the air." Many in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, their newfound hope suddenly threatened. Nehemiah turned slowly to face the interlopers, measuring his response carefully. The assembly held its breath, witnessing the first confrontation between their potential savior and the neighboring officials who had long kept Jerusalem vulnerable. "The God of heaven will make us prosper," Nehemiah replied, his voice level but firm. "We, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." Sanballat's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Nehemiah had already turned back to the assembly, effectively dismissing the foreign officials. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we begin." The direct challenge to Sanballat and Tobiah's influence sent an unmistakable message. This rebuilding project would not be deterred by political intimidation. As word spread throughout Jerusalem, people began to view Nehemiah not merely as an official with Persian backing, but as a leader willing to stand against the very forces that had kept them subjugated. That night, as Nehemiah again sought God's guidance in prayer, he knew that the real battles were just beginning. Sanballat and Tobiah would not retreat easily from a challenge to their power. The people of Jerusalem, though inspired, remained wounded by generations of failure and oppression, and the physical task of rebuilding still loomed as a seemingly impossible challenge. Yet as he concluded his prayers, Nehemiah felt a profound sense of peace. "The God who has brought me this far," he whispered into the darkness, "will see this work completed. United we build. A city transforms the next morning. Jerusalem awakened to a city transformed, not by physical change, but by the spark of hope that spread from household to household. People emerged from their dwellings with a new sense of purpose, gathering at designated sections of the wall where Nehemiah had assigned them to work. Nehemiah's organizational strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. Rather than creating a central workforce, he divided the perimeter into manageable sections, assigning specific families or professional groups to rebuild the portion of wall nearest their homes or workshops. This approach not only distributed the workload, but gave each group a personal stake in the restoration. "You will defend most fiercely what protects your own loved ones," Nehemiah explained to his lieutenants as they finalized the work assignments. "When a man builds the wall that shields his children, he builds with his whole heart." By mid-morning, the sounds of construction echoed throughout the city. The scrape of stone against stone, the rhythmic thud of mallets, and the calls of workers coordinating their efforts created a symphony of renewal that had not been heard in Jerusalem for generations. Near the sheep gate, Eliashib the high priest led fellow priests in clearing debris and setting foundation stones. Their religious robes had been exchanged for simple work tunics, their hands, usually occupied with sacred implements, now calloused from lifting rocks. Joachim the merchant, once skeptical, now supervised the rebuilding near the fish gate alongside fellow traders. Their knowledge of materials and experience negotiating with suppliers proved invaluable as they organized the procurement of mortar and timber. "I've spent my life assessing the value of goods," Joachim remarked to Nehemiah during an inspection visit. "Never did I imagine I would help restore something truly priceless." The daughters of Shalom, breaking with tradition that typically kept women from construction work, took responsibility for a section of wall. Their determination inspired others, demonstrating that the rebuilding of Jerusalem was a task for every citizen, regardless of gender or social position. The strategic genius of Nehemiah's approach became increasingly apparent as the work progressed. With families building near their homes, workers could easily transition between their daily occupations and wall construction. Meals could be prepared nearby, children could assist with lighter tasks, and each evening, workers could see tangible progress in the section they had personally touched. Moreover, the distribution of labor created healthy competition between groups, with each section trying to advance their portion of wall most rapidly. What might have been an overwhelming project when viewed in its entirety became manageable when broken into family-sized responsibilities. Nehemiah moved constantly around the perimeter, encouraging workers, solving problems, and ensuring quality. His hands were as dirty as any laborer's, his skin as sunburned. When a section of foundation proved unstable, he worked alongside the builders to excavate deeper. When supplies ran short, he personally negotiated with merchants from neighboring regions, leveraging his Persian authority to secure fair prices. "A leader who stays clean while others sweat earns no respect," he told Ezra the scribe, who had come to observe the progress. "These walls rise on shared sacrifice." The rebuilding effort transformed more than Jerusalem's physical appearance. It healed social divisions within the community. Priests worked alongside perfumers, goldsmiths beside government officials. People who had previously interacted only in marketplace transactions now passed water skins to each other, shared tools, and together celebrated each new row of stones set in place. Malachi, silversmith whose workshop had been vulnerable to thieves for years, found himself working beside Joshua, a temple musician whose family had long patronized Malachi's craft. "I've made ceremonial cups for your temple ceremonies for 20 years, Malachi remarked as they fitted a stone into place. "Yet this is the first time we've truly spoken as men." Joshua nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Perhaps that's what these walls are really building. Not just protection from outside enemies, but connections between those within." As sections of wall began to rise, reaching waist height and then shoulder height, the people's confidence grew proportionally. Children ran along completed sections, their laughter a sound rarely heard in previous years. Elders who had seen Jerusalem before its destruction wept openly as familiar outlines of the city began to re-emerge from decades of ruin. Even some from neighboring regions, impressed by the Jerusalemites' determination, came to offer assistance. Not all outsiders shared Sanballat and Tobiah's hostility, and several merchants from nearby villages contributed materials or labor, recognizing that a secure Jerusalem would benefit regional trade. But not everyone celebrated the city's rapid transformation. From the hills surrounding Jerusalem, Sanballat watched the walls rising with growing alarm. What had seemed an impossible project was advancing day by day, threatening to undermine his influence in the region. Gathering his associates, including Tobiah and Geshem the Arab, Sanballat plotted his response. "This cannot be allowed to continue," he told them, his voice tight with anger. "If Jerusalem regains its walls, we lose our advantage. These Jews will no longer depend on our protection or bow to our demands." Tobiah nodded in agreement, his calculating eyes fixed on the distant figure of Nehemiah moving among the workers. "Every stone they place is a statement of defiance." Every section completed, is a rejection of our authority. Their first strategy was psychological warfare, public mockery designed to demoralize the builders. Approaching as near as they dared to the construction, Sanballat shouted for all to hear, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and burned ones at that?" Tobiah, standing beside him, added his own taunt. "Indeed, even if a fox would climb up on what they are building, their stone wall would collapse." The insults, clearly audible to the nearest workers, were calculated to plant seeds of doubt. Could such extensive restoration really succeed? Were they foolish to believe in Nehemiah's vision? Would their efforts ultimately prove futile? The taunts rippled through the work parties, causing some to pause uncertainly. Nehemiah, alerted to the disturbance, arrived quickly at the section facing Sanballat's position. Rather than engaging directly with the mockers or attempting to silence them, he gathered the workers in a tight circle. "Do not answer them," he instructed, his voice low but intense. "Their words are empty wind. Instead, let us take our concerns to the one whose opinion truly matters." There, in full view of their enemies but beyond their hearing, Nehemiah led the workers in prayer. "Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." The shared prayer transformed the moment from one of potential discouragement to renewed determination. The workers returned to their tasks with reinforced resolve. Their backs literally turned to the mockers as stones continued to be set in place. "Their taunts will fade," Nehemiah assured the builders as he moved among them. "But these walls will stand for generations." Indeed, far from halting progress, the opposition seemed to energize the work. The wall continued to rise, section by section, until half its intended height had been reached around the entire perimeter, a stunning achievement that visibly restored Jerusalem's profile against the skyline. Seeing that mockery had failed to halt construction, Sanballat and his allies resorted to more dangerous tactics. Messengers brought Nehemiah disturbing intelligence. Armed groups from surrounding regions were planning coordinated attacks against the work parties. The threat was credible and serious. The partially completed walls still had many gaps, and the workers, focused on construction, were vulnerable to sudden assault. Such an attack could not only halt the rebuilding, but potentially cost lives, dealing a devastating blow to morale. That evening, as the sun set behind the western hills, Nehemiah called an emergency meeting of family leaders. The situation demanded immediate action, but he was determined not to abandon the rebuilding, even temporarily. "From this day forward," he announced, "half of our men will work while half stand guard with spears, shields, bows, and armor." The new reality dawned the next morning. Workers arrived to find weapons distributed and guards positioned at strategic points. Masons laid stones with swords strapped to their sides. Those carrying building materials held a weapon in one hand and their load in the other. Nehemiah also instituted an emergency response system. "The work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us." The image of builders working with weapons ready became a powerful symbol of Jerusalem's determination. From sunrise to the appearance of the stars, the work continued under this new, vigilant arrangement. Even Nehemiah and his personal guard did not remove their clothes, except for washing, maintaining constant readiness. Word of Jerusalem's armed builders spread quickly throughout the region. The prospect of attacking workers who were now prepared for battle significantly increased the risk for potential assailants. Sanballat and his allies found themselves in a difficult position. Direct military conflict could draw the attention of Persian authorities, potentially invoking the empire's wrath if harm came to an official appointed by the king. For the moment, the threat of violence receded, though tension remained high along the perimeter. The wall continued to rise, now not just a construction project but a statement of defiance against those who had long kept Jerusalem vulnerable. Observing the workers during this period of heightened alert, Nehemiah noted the extraordinary transformation in his people. Men who months earlier had been downcast merchants or ritualistic priests now stood tall as both builders and defenders. Women who had lived in constant fear now moved with purpose, bringing water and food to the workers with heads held high. "See how they stand now," Nehemiah remarked to Ezekiel the priest, watching workers set stones with weapons at their sides. "They are remembering who they were always meant to be." Ezekiel nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is the greater restoration happening here, not just of walls, but of a people's spirit." As Jerusalem's defenses visibly strengthened day by day, both literally and figuratively, even some who had initially doubted began to recognize the hand of God in their midst. What had seemed impossible was unfolding before their eyes, not through overwhelming force, but through unity, strategy, and unwavering faith. The wall continued to rise, and with it, the hope of a people reborn. Internal strife and a leader's response, while the external walls of Jerusalem steadily rose despite enemy threats. Internal divisions threatened to undermine everything Nehemiah had accomplished. The problem emerged not from construction challenges, but from socioeconomic inequality that had been festering for years within the community. One morning, as workers assembled at their sections of wall, a commotion broke out near the eastern perimeter. A group of families, thin from hunger and dressed in tattered clothing, had gathered with wives and children to make their grievances public. "We have large families," their spokesman cried, his voice ragged with emotion. "We must get grain to stay alive." Others joined in with specific complaints. "We have mortgaged our fields, vineyards, and homes to get grain during the famine. We have borrowed money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards," added another. Most disturbing were the cries of parents who had been forced to sell their children into servitude to wealthy fellow Jews. "We have had to sell our sons and daughters to be slaves. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, and we are powerless to redeem them because our fields and vineyards now belong to others." The crowd of protesters grew as more families joined, their combined voices carrying across the construction site. Work slowed and then halted as builders turned to witness the unfolding scene. Nehemiah, alerted to the disturbance, arrived quickly. The sight that greeted him was heartbreaking. Families whose participation in the wall building had filled them with pride were now publicly exposing their private shame. Hunger, debt, and the separation of families through servitude. What made the situation particularly troubling was that this suffering came not at the hands of foreign oppressors, but through exploitation by their own community members. The very unity Nehemiah had cultivated for the wall's construction was being undermined by economic predation. Watching the scene, Nehemiah experienced a surge of emotions, compassion for the suffering families, but also blazing anger toward those who had exploited their vulnerability. For a leader whose success had come through careful diplomacy and strategic planning, what followed was uncharacteristically direct. "I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words," Nehemiah would later recall. The injustice struck at the heart of everything he believed about God's people and their responsibility toward one another. After taking time to master his emotions and consider his response, Nehemiah called for an assembly of all Jerusalem's nobles and officials, those wealthy enough to be creditors to their poorer neighbors. The gathering took place in the open area near the temple, where both the accused exploiters and their victims could attend. The wealthy arrived in fine robes, many visibly irritated at being pulled from their businesses or administrative duties. They stood in clusters, maintaining distance from the common laborers and poor families who gathered at the edges of the assembly. Nehemiah surveyed the gathering, his expression grave. "Wow!" When he finally spoke, his voice carried not just authority but personal indignation. "You are exacting interest from your own brothers," he declared, the accusation hanging in the air like a drawn sword. The charge was particularly damning because the Torah explicitly forbade Israelites from charging interest to fellow Jews. This wasn't merely economic exploitation. It was direct disobedience to divine law. "We have done our best to redeem our Jewish brothers who were sold to foreigners," Nehemiah continued, his voice rising. "Now you are selling your own brothers, and they are sold back to us." The wealthy shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with both Nehemiah and the poor families watching from the assembly's edges. The contrast was stark. Some citizens were literally giving their bodies to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, while others were profiting from the community's hardship. "What you are doing is not good," Nehemiah pressed, moving closer to the group of nobles. "Should you not walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies?" The reference to foreign enemies was strategic, a reminder that internal exploitation accomplished what Sanballat and Tobiah could not: the weakening of Jerusalem from within. "I and my brothers and my servants are also lending the people money and grain," Nehemiah acknowledged, establishing his understanding of financial matters. "But let us stop this charging of interest." Then came the specific demand: return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. The assembly fell silent. Nehemiah's demand was extraordinary. Not a gradual reform or a future policy change, but immediate restitution. He was asking the wealthy to voluntarily return property they had legally acquired through debt collection, effectively erasing substantial assets from their holdings. The nobles exchanged glances, calculating the financial implications. Some appeared ready to object, to defend their legal right to collect debts and charge interest despite religious prohibitions. Before they could formulate their response, Nehemiah took a handful of his outer robe and shook it out dramatically before the assembly. "May God shake out everyone from house and property who does not fulfill this promise," he declared. "May they be shaken out and emptied." The symbolic act, an accompanying curse, emphasized the spiritual gravity of the situation. This was not merely an administrative decision, but a matter of covenant faithfulness with divine consequences. The assembly responded with a collective amen and praised the Lord. More importantly, the wealthy followed through on their commitment. That very day, properties began to be returned, debts forgiven, and interest payments canceled. Children were reunited with parents as servitude agreements were nullified. Families reclaimed fields and vineyards they had thought lost forever. The economic redistribution was radical and immediate, transforming Jerusalem's social landscape alongside its physical reconstruction. Nehemiah's handling of this internal crisis revealed a different dimension of leadership than his management of external threats. With Sanballat and Tobiah, he had employed strategic avoidance and tactical countermeasures. With internal injustice, he confronted the problem directly, using moral authority rather than Persian political backing to effect change. The resolution of this socio-economic crisis strengthened rather than diminish the community's unity. Wealthy citizens, having made significant financial sacrifices, found renewed purpose in the shared mission of rebuilding. Poor families, relieved of crushing debt, worked with fresh energy on their sections of wall. Nehemiah himself set an example of economic selflessness. As governor, he was entitled to substantial food allowances and tax privileges, yet he refused these perquisites, paying for his large household's expenses from personal resources. The former governors who preceded me laid heavy burdens on the people, taking from them food and wine, as well as 40 shekels of silver, he explained to his staff. Even their servants lorded it over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Throughout his 12-year governance, Nehemiah maintained this practice, never collecting the food allowance to which he was entitled. Moreover, he regularly hosted large gatherings at his table, feeding 150 Jewish officials, along with visitors from surrounding nations, all from his personal funds. Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people. He would pray privately, seeking divine recognition rather than public acclaim for his financial sacrifices. The integration of economic justice with physical reconstruction represented Nehemiah's holistic understanding of restoration. Jerusalem needed more than stone walls for true security. It required a return to covenant principles of equity and mutual support among God's people. As both the physical wall and social cohesion strengthened, Nehemiah's enemies grew increasingly desperate. Having failed with mockery and threats of violence, they attempted a new strategy: deceit. Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to Nehemiah. "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." The invitation appeared conciliatory, a peace conference after months of hostility. Some of Nehemiah's advisors urged him to accept, seeing an opportunity to normalize relations with neighboring governors and reduce regional tensions. But Nehemiah's discernment had been sharpened by months of opposition. He recognized the invitation as a trap, likely an assassination attempt disguised as diplomacy. Meeting in a remote village would separate him from the protection of Jerusalem's community and his personal guards. "They were planning to harm me," he explained to his inner circle. "I am doing a great work and cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you?" 4 times the invitation came, and 4 times Nehemiah refused with the same response. Finally, Sanballat sent an open letter, deliberately unsealed so its contents would spread, implying that Nehemiah was planning rebellion against Persia, with ambitions to declare himself king. The accusation was politically dangerous, designed to create fear among Jerusalem's residents that Nehemiah's actions might bring Persian military reprisal. If such rumors reached Persian authorities, the consequences could be severe. Rather than engaging with the false narrative or becoming defensive, Nehemiah responded with calm dismissal. "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are inventing it in your own mind." He recognized that his enemy's new strategy was psychological, to make him act out of fear, either by halting the reconstruction or by taking actions that might appear suspicious to Persian observers. In a private moment of prayer, recorded only in his personal account, Nehemiah revealed the emotional weight of this constant opposition. "Now strengthen my hands, O God," he prayed, acknowledging his need for divine reinforcement during this prolonged campaign of intimidation. As these external and internal challenges were navigated, the wall continued to rise. Families worked with renewed vigor, now not only rebuilding physical defenses, but reconstructing a society aligned with their deepest values. Stone by stone, relationship by relationship, Jerusalem was being transformed. Victory in 52 days, the relentless pace of construction, the constant vigilance against enemies, and the resolution of internal conflicts had taken their toll on Jerusalem's people. Exhaustion shadowed the faces of workers who had maintained grueling physical labor for weeks while managing their regular family responsibilities. Yet the wall continued to rise, section by section, approaching completion. On a bright morning in the month of Elul, 52 days after construction began, Shemaiah, a young stone mason, placed the final block in his family's assigned section near the valley gate. The stone settled into place with a satisfying thud, fitting perfectly between its neighbors. "It is done," he said simply, stepping back to view the completed wall segment. Similar scenes unfolded around Jerusalem's perimeter as each group finished their portions. Family by family, guild by guild, they completed their assignments until, remarkably, the entire wall stood finished. No gaps, no weak sections, a continuous barrier encircling the city. 52 days. Just over 7 weeks from ruins to completed fortifications. The achievement was unprecedented, seemingly impossible, yet undeniably real. When all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, Nehemiah recorded in his memoir. They perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Even Sanballat and Tobiah, who had employed every tactic from mockery to threats of violence to diplomatic deception, fell silent in the face of the completed walls. Their influence in the region diminished as Jerusalem once again stood as a fortified city, capable of defending itself. The psychological impact of the wall's completion transformed Jerusalem's residents. People who had lived for generations with vulnerability and shame now walked taller, their steps more confident on streets, protected by towering stone defenses. Children who had grown up fearing raids from bandits and wild animals now played freely, the wall a visible reminder of their security. Merchants whose goods had been subject to easy theft now established more permanent market stalls. Artisans who had hesitated to use valuable materials for fear of theft now created finer works, contributing to Jerusalem's renewed economic vitality. But Nehemiah understood that physical walls alone did not ensure a city's security. Proper administration and spiritual renewal were equally essential to Jerusalem's restoration. With the wall completed, he appointed his brother Hanani and Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, as administrators of Jerusalem. Both men were chosen not primarily for their skills, but for their character. They were more faithful and God-fearing than many. Under their leadership, strict protocols were established for the city gates. Unlike many ancient cities where gates remained open from dawn until dusk, Jerusalem's gates were not opened until well after sunrise, when the day was fully hot. They were closed and barred before sunset, while it was still daylight, eliminating the vulnerable twilight hours when attacks often occurred. Additionally, Nehemiah organized a guard system for the wall, with residents responsible for the section nearest their homes, a continuation of the ownership principle that had made the construction so effective. "Let every man and his servant lodge within Jerusalem," Nehemiah directed, ensuring that the city maintained adequate population for defense. Many had established homes outside the walls during the years when the city lay exposed. Now Nehemiah encouraged return to the urban center to maintain community strength. With physical security established and administration organized, Nehemiah turned to the spiritual dimension of Jerusalem's restoration. Working alongside Ezra the scribe, who had arrived in Jerusalem years before Nehemiah, he organized a public reading of the Torah to reconnect the people with their spiritual heritage. On the first day of the 7th month, a timing rich with religious significance, the entire community gathered in the square before the water gate. Men, women, and children old enough to understand assembled early in the morning, an expectant hush falling over the crowd as Ezra opened the ancient scrolls. Standing on a wooden platform built specifically for this purpose, Ezra began to read the law, of Moses. From daybreak until noon, his voice carried across the assembly, bringing words that many had never heard directly, though they had lived nominally under their authority. As the reading progressed, an extraordinary thing happened. People began to weep, not quiet tears but open weeping that spread through the crowd. The gap between divine expectation and human reality, between covenant promise and historical experience, overwhelmed them with grief and recognition. Observing this response, Nehemiah stepped forward, raising his hands for attention. His next words revealed his understanding that spiritual restoration required not only acknowledgement of failure, but celebration of divine mercy. "This day is holy to the Lord your God," he announced to the tearful assembly. "Do not mourn or weep. Go your way, eat the fat and drink sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." The pivot from mourning to celebration was intentional. Nehemiah recognized that excessive focus on past failures could paralyze rather than energize the community. The people needed strength for the journey ahead, and that strength would come from joy, not grief. In the days that followed, the spiritual revitalization deepened as the people discovered instructions for the festival of booths, Sukkot, in the Torah readings. This harvest festival, requiring families to construct temporary shelters and live in them for 7 days, had not been properly observed since the days of Joshua, nearly 1,000 years. With characteristic enthusiasm, Jerusalem's residents gathered branches from the hills surrounding the city and built shelters on their rooftops, in their courtyards, in the temple courts, and in public squares. For 7 days, the city was transformed into a garden of green booths, with families dwelling in these temporary structures as their ancestors had done, when they were wanderers dependent on divine protection. And there was very great rejoicing, the record states, capturing the spiritual renewal that had accompanied physical reconstruction. The culmination of this period came with a solemn ceremony dedicating the newly completed wall. Nehemiah organized 2 large Thanksgiving choirs and processions, one moving clockwise and the other counterclockwise around the top of the wall. Led by priests with trumpets and musicians with cymbals, harps, and lyres, the processions made their triumphant circuits of the wall. The songs of thanksgiving echoed across the Kidron Valley and could be heard far into the surrounding countryside, a public declaration that Jerusalem had risen from ruins. The joy of Jerusalem was heard far away, observers noted, the sound carrying both physical and metaphorical significance. After decades of silence and shame, Jerusalem's voice was once again raised in strength. The international impact of Jerusalem's restoration was significant. Nations that had dismissed the Jewish people as a declining, vulnerable population now reassessed their position. Trade routes began to incorporate Jerusalem more prominently, recognizing the city's renewed stability and security. They perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God, Nehemiah recorded, noting how the project's supernatural speed and success had influenced regional perceptions. For Nehemiah personally, the completion of the wall represented not an ending but a transition. Having fulfilled his initial promise to King Artaxerxes, he could have returned to his comfortable position in the Persian court. Instead, he chose to remain in Jerusalem as governor for 12 years, overseeing the city's continued development and protecting the reforms he had initiated. During this period, Nehemiah maintained his exceptional personal standard, refusing governor's privileges and hosting large groups at his own expense. His leadership style combined strategic brilliance with personal integrity, creating a model that inspired others to similar sacrifice and service. "Remember me with favor, my God," he would pray privately, seeking divine recognition rather than human accolades for his work. The completed wall stood as the most visible symbol of Jerusalem's transformation. But Nehemiah's true legacy extended far beyond stone and mortar. He had rebuilt not just a city's defenses, but its social fabric, economic practices, administrative systems, and spiritual foundations. Jerusalem's restoration under Nehemiah offers profound insights for contemporary challenges, both personal and societal. His leadership demonstrated that rebuilding what has been broken requires not only vision and resources, but also the courage to face opposition, the wisdom to resolve internal conflicts, and the spiritual foundation to sustain the work. The wall that many had deemed impossible now encircled Jerusalem in solid reality, a testament to what becomes possible when divine calling meets human determination, and when a community unites around a shared vision of restoration. Legacy of a rebuilder. Years after the wall's completion, Nehemiah returned to Susa to fulfill his commitment to King Artaxerxes. His absence from Jerusalem proved revealing. Some of the reforms he had instituted began to erode without his vigilant presence. The high priest Eliashib, demonstrating questionable judgment, had even prepared a room in the temple courts for Tobiah the Ammonite, one of Nehemiah's most persistent opponents. When Nehemiah eventually returned to Jerusalem and discovered these compromises, his response was characteristically direct. He personally threw Tobiah's furniture out of the temple chamber, ordered the room purified, and restored it to its proper use for storing grain offerings and temple implements. "Remember me for this, my God," he prayed, "and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services." This final chapter of Nehemiah's story reveals perhaps his greatest contribution. He established not just physical structures, but standards and principles that outlasted his personal presence. Though some backsliding occurred in his absence, the foundation he laid enabled Jerusalem to recognize and correct its deviations, rather than continuing in compromise. The walls of Jerusalem would stand for centuries, repeatedly tested by sieges and invasions. Though eventually destroyed by Roman forces in 70 CE, they had fulfilled their purpose for generations, providing the security necessary for Jewish cultural and religious life to flourish in its homeland. More significant than the physical walls was the restoration of confidence and identity that Nehemiah catalyzed among the Jewish people. A community that had accepted vulnerability and marginalization as its permanent condition rediscovered its capacity for unity, self-governance, and spiritual fidelity. The methods Nehemiah employed throughout his mission offer timeless principles for accomplishing seemingly impossible tasks. He began with deep concern that translated into action, not mere sympathy. He prepared thoroughly before acting, securing resources and authority. He personally investigated the full extent of the problem. He inspired others by connecting the challenge to both practical needs and spiritual purpose. He organized work in ways that gave people ownership and accountability. He anticipated and prepared for opposition, rather than being surprised by it. He addressed internal injustice as promptly as external threat. He led by example, sharing in the hardships and sacrifices he asked of others. He maintained focus on the primary goal despite multiple distractions. He integrated physical reconstruction with spiritual renewal, understanding their interdependence. These principles transcend Nehemiah's specific historical context, offering guidance for contemporary leaders facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, whether in community development, organizational change, or personal transformation. For those confronting situations where hope seems foolish, broken relationships, communities in decline, systems that appear beyond repair, Nehemiah's example offers both practical wisdom and inspirational courage. His story demonstrates that reclamation of what has been ruined is possible when vision, strategy, and faith work in concert. Three key lessons emerge from Nehemiah's experience. First, restoration begins with those willing to be deeply troubled by brokenness. Nehemiah could have maintained his comfortable position in the Persian palace, dismissing Jerusalem's condition as unfortunate, but not his responsibility. Instead, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his people's vulnerability and shame. Transformative leadership always begins with the capacity to be genuinely disturbed by what others have accepted as normal. Second, opposition to rebuilding often comes from those who benefit from the status quo. Sanballat and Tobiah's persistent attempts to stop Jerusalem's reconstruction stemmed from their vested interest in the city's continued vulnerability. Significant change always threatens those whose power or privilege depends on current conditions, making opposition inevitable rather than surprising. Third, physical reconstruction must be accompanied by spiritual and social renewal to be sustainable. Nehemiah recognized that walls alone could not secure Jerusalem's future. The community needed reconnection with its foundational values and practices. True restoration addresses not only visible damage, but the underlying patterns that allowed deterioration to occur. As we reflect on Nehemiah's legacy, three questions challenge us to apply his example to our own contexts. What broken walls in your community or life have you accepted as permanent, failing to envision their possible restoration? Where might you need to build with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other, working constructively while actively defending against forces that oppose progress? How can you contribute to not just physical rebuilding, but the renewal of values and relationships that make communities truly secure? Nehemiah's transformation from royal cupbearer to visionary rebuilder reminds us that leadership often emerges from unexpected places when someone cares enough to move from concern to action. In a world where systemic problems can seem too entrenched for meaningful change, his example offers both practical methodology and renewed hope. The walls of Jerusalem, rebuilt in just 52 days after standing in ruins for generations, testify to what becomes possible when divine purpose aligns with human determination, and when a community unites around a vision of restoration transcends what seems reasonable to expect. Remember me with favor, my God, Nehemiah prayed as he completed his work. His legacy answers that prayer, as each generation of readers finds in his story not just historical information, but transformative inspiration for their own walls that wait to be rebuilt. Thank you for joining us today on this journey through one of history's greatest comeback stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What broken walls are you facing that seemed impossible to rebuild until you considered Nehemiah's example? How might his leadership principles apply to challenges in your family, workplace, or community? Please do your comments below, sharing your personal reflections on this remarkable story of vision, perseverance, and faith. And if you found value in today's exploration, we invite you to subscribe to the Deep Bible Stories channel for more insights that bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary challenges. Until next time, may you find the courage to rebuild what others have deemed irreparable, and the wisdom to see opportunity where others see only ruins.